My father stood up at the family reunion dinner and announced he was proud of all his children, except the loser who never amounted to anything. He had no idea I'd just bought the company that employed him. Welcome to Revenge Galore. If you crave real gripping stories where justice hits hard and betrayal never goes unpunished, this channel is your new favorite place. Please subscribe. My name is Marcus Kane, and for 32 years, I've been the invisible son in a family that worships success. At least, their version of success. My father, William Kane, built Kane Industries from the ground up, a mid-sized manufacturing company that supplies automotive parts to major Detroit automakers. He's the kind of man who measures worth in trophies, headlines, and quarterly reports. And by his standards, I've always been worthless. The family hierarchy was established before I could even walk. Derek, my older brother, was the golden child from day one. Star quarterback in high school, full ride to Michigan State, now running his own real estate empire with dad's connections and startup capital. Then there's Sophia, my younger sister, the family princess. Valedictorian, law degree from Northwestern, currently making partner track at a prestigious Chicago firm thanks to dad's business network. And then there's me, the middle child who never quite fit the mold. I remember the exact moment I realized I was different in my father's eyes. I was 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a science fair trophy I'd won for a project on renewable energy. It was first place in my grade and I was bursting with pride. Derek walked in with a participation ribbon from some baseball tournament, and Dad immediately swept him up in a bear hug. That's my boy. Future MVP right there. I held up my trophy expecting the same enthusiasm. Dad glanced at it and nodded. That's nice, Marcus. Go put it in your room. Derek got the bear hug. I got a nod. That pattern would repeat itself for the next 24 years. When Derek made varsity football as a sophomore, Dad threw him a party and invited half the neighborhood. When I got accepted into the National Honor Society, Dad said, "Good for you," and went back to reading the sports section. When Sophia won the state debate championship, Dad took out a full-page ad in the local paper celebrating his brilliant daughter. When I graduated valedictorian from my high school, Dad attended the ceremony but spent the entire time on his phone, closing some business deal. The comparisons were constant and cutting. Why can't you be more like Derek? He's got drive, ambition. He knows how to work a room. Or, Sophia's going places. She's got that killer instinct. You're too soft, Marcus. Too quiet. Success doesn't come to people who blend into the wallpaper. I learned early that academic achievement meant nothing if it didn't come with social status or athletic glory. I could have a 4.0 GPA, but Derek's touchdown would always be more important. I could solve complex mathematical problems, but Sophia's ability to charm a jury was what impressed people at dinner parties. By the time I graduated college with a degree in computer science and business administration, I'd accepted my role as the family disappointment. Dad helped Derek get his real estate license and loaned him $200,000 to start his business. He used his connections to get Sophia internships at top law firms. When I asked for help starting a tech consulting company, he laughed. Tech consulting? Marcus, you can barely hold a conversation at a cocktail party. How are you going to convince CEOs to trust you with their business? Maybe you should find a nice stable job somewhere. Not everyone's cut out to be an entrepreneur. So I did find a stable job. I got hired as a junior analyst at a mid-level investment firm, making $45,000 a year while living in a studio apartment and driving a used Honda Civic. Derek was already pulling in six figures from his real estate deals. Sophia was making partner track money at her law firm. And I was the guy who answered phones and ran financial models for other people's ideas. But here's what my family never understood about me. Being overlooked gave me the perfect cover to watch, learn, and plan. While Derek was networking at country club events and Sophia was making headlines for high-profile cases, I was quietly building something they couldn't see. I started freelance consulting in the evenings, helping small businesses optimize their operations and financial systems. Most of my clients were companies too small for Derek to notice or Sophia to represent, but they were real businesses with real problems that needed solving. I had a gift for seeing inefficiencies and finding solutions. Maybe it came from years of being invisible. When you're used to being overlooked, you develop sharp observational skills. You notice things other people miss. You see patterns in data that others dismiss as noise. My first major breakthrough came 18 months into my consulting work. A small logistics company was hemorrhaging money due to inefficient routing and inventory management. I spent 3 weeks analyzing their operations and designed a new system that cut their costs by 30% while improving delivery times. They were so impressed they recommended me to 3 other companies in their network. Word spread quietly through the business community. I wasn't the flashy consultant who promised miracles and charged premium fees. I was the guy who actually solved problems. I delivered results that showed up on bottom lines and quarterly reports. My client base grew from small local businesses to mid-sized regional companies. But I kept my success quiet. At family dinners, when Dad asked about my work, I'd give vague answers about doing some analysis for local businesses. He'd nod dismissively and turn the conversation back to Derek's latest property flip or Sophia's courtroom victories. They assumed I was still the same underachieving son, making modest money at a forgettable job. That assumption would prove to be the most expensive mistake of my father's life. After 3 years of building my consulting practice, I made a decision that would change everything. I left my analyst job and incorporated Kane Strategic Solutions. Not because I wanted to use the family name, but because I wanted my father to eventually realize what he'd missed. I kept the business small and focused, working with companies that needed operational efficiency rather than flashy marketing or high-profile representation. My specialty became turnaround consulting for struggling businesses. Companies that were bleeding money, facing bankruptcy, or dealing with operational crises. The work was challenging and often thankless, but it taught me something invaluable: how to read a company's vulnerabilities from the outside. I learned to identify the weak points in corporate structures, the financial dependencies that could be exploited, the key relationships that held business empires together. Every failing business I helped save taught me something new about how successful businesses could be destroyed. By my 28th birthday, Kane Strategic Solutions had quietly become one of the most effective turnaround consulting firms in the Midwest. We weren't the biggest or the most famous, but we had a 90% success rate with companies that other consultants had written off as hopeless. My reputation in the business community was solid gold, even if my family had no idea. The breakthrough that would eventually destroy my father's world came from an unexpected source. Austin Reed, the former CFO of an automotive parts supplier that had gone bankrupt 3 years earlier. Reed contacted me because he'd heard about my success with operational turnarounds, and he had a proposition. "Marcus," he said during our first meeting, "there's a company I used to work with that's been making some very questionable financial decisions. They're over-leveraged, dependent on a few major contracts, and their leadership is arrogant enough to think they're untouchable. With the right pressure at the right time, they could be acquired for a fraction of their actual value." The company he was talking about was Kane Industries, my father's business. Reed had been watching Kane Industries for years, ever since Dad had terminated their supplier contract during the 2019 automotive downturn. It had been a smart business decision at the time, but Reed had never forgotten the way Dad had handled the termination, with characteristic arrogance and dismissiveness. "Your father thinks he's bulletproof because he's got 3 major contracts with Detroit automakers," Reed explained. "But those contracts are up for renewal next year, and the industry is shifting toward electric vehicles. Companies like Kane Industries that haven't adapted their manufacturing capabilities are going to be left behind." Reed showed me financial documents that painted a clear picture of Kane Industries' vulnerabilities. Dad had been so focused on maximizing short-term profits that he'd neglected long-term strategic planning. The company's equipment was outdated, their R&D budget was minimal, and they had no capabilities for manufacturing electric vehicle components. With the right leverage, Reed continued, Kane Industries could be forced into a position where they'd have to accept an acquisition offer. Especially if that offer came at a time when their contract renewals were in jeopardy. I spent the next 6 months quietly investigating my father's business. Using my consulting contacts and industry knowledge, I mapped out Kane Industries' entire financial structure, their supplier relationships, their contract dependencies, and their competitive vulnerabilities. What I found was even worse than Reed had suggested. Dad had been coasting on relationships and reputation for years. Kane Industries was profitable, but only because they'd been grandfathered into long-term contracts that were above current market rates. When those contracts came up for renewal, they'd be competing against more efficient, more technologically advanced suppliers who could offer the same services for 20% less. But the real vulnerability was something Reed hadn't mentioned: Dad's personal guarantees. In order to finance some equipment upgrades 5 years earlier, he'd personally guaranteed the company's debt. If Kane Industries defaulted on their loans, Dad would be personally liable for $8.2 million. I realized I had the power to destroy my father's empire, but I needed the resources to execute the plan. That's when I made the most important decision of my life. I started acquiring companies. Using the network I'd built through my consulting work, I began identifying small businesses that were undervalued or facing temporary difficulties. Companies with good fundamentals but poor management, or strong market positions but inefficient operations. I would offer to buy them at fair prices, improve their operations using my consulting expertise, and then use their increased profitability to finance additional acquisitions. My first acquisition was a small manufacturing company that made precision tools for automotive suppliers. The owner was approaching retirement and wanted to sell, but he was asking a price that reflected emotional attachment rather than market value. I offered him 15% less than his asking price, but with a consulting agreement that would improve the company's operations and justify his original valuation within 2 years. The deal worked perfectly. Within 18 months, I'd streamlined the company's operations, expanded their client base, and increased their profitability by 40%. The original owner was so impressed that he recommended me to 2 other business owners who were considering selling. Over the next 3 years, I acquired 7 companies. Not through hostile takeovers or aggressive tactics, but through careful analysis, fair offers, and proven results. My portfolio included 2 manufacturing companies, a logistics firm, a software development company, and 3 specialized consulting businesses. But my family knew none of this. At Christmas dinners and birthday parties, they still saw me as Marcus the underachiever. Derek would brag about his latest $2 million property deal while I sat quietly, letting them assume I was still struggling to make ends meet. Sophia would discuss her high-profile cases while I nodded along, never mentioning that I'd helped restructure companies with revenues larger than her law firms. The turning point came during my 30th birthday party. Dad had reluctantly agreed to host a small family dinner, though he made it clear he considered it a chore rather than a celebration. Derek arrived with his new girlfriend, a model he'd met through his real estate connections. Sophia brought her fiancé, a fellow attorney from a prestigious family. During dinner, Dad launched into his usual monologue about success and achievement. Derek's really building something special with his real estate business. Sophia's on track to make partner before she's 35. It just goes to show what you can accomplish when you have vision and drive. Then he turned to me with that familiar look of disappointment. Marcus, you're 30 now. Don't you think it's time to get serious about your career? Maybe I could help you find a position at Kane Industries. Nothing too challenging, but something stable. The condescension in his voice was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Here I was, running a portfolio of companies with combined annual revenues of $50 million, and he was offering me an entry-level position at his mid-sized manufacturing firm. That's when I decided it was time to start planning his destruction. The next 18 months were the most intense of my life. I used every resource at my disposal to position myself for a hostile acquisition of Kane Industries. I studied their contract renewal timelines, identified their key vulnerabilities, and began systematically undermining their competitive position. My first move was to use my manufacturing companies to bid against Kane Industries for smaller contracts. We could afford to operate at thin margins because we were more efficient and had lower overhead costs. Every contract we won was a contract Kane Industries lost, slowly eroding their market share and financial stability. My second move was more subtle. Through my industry connections, I began spreading information about Kane Industries' technological limitations. Not false information, everything I shared was absolutely true. But I made sure that key decision-makers at major automotive companies understood that Kane Industries was falling behind the industry curve on electric vehicle component manufacturing. My third move was the most crucial. I approached Austin Reed with a proposal. If he could help me identify the exact timing and terms of Kane Industries' contract renewals, I would give him a significant equity stake in the acquisition company I was forming. Reed had maintained relationships throughout the automotive industry, and he was able to provide insider information about when Kane Industries would be most vulnerable. The perfect opportunity came in March of my 32nd year. General Motors had decided to restructure their supplier network to focus on companies capable of manufacturing electric vehicle components. Kane Industries was one of 12 suppliers whose contracts were being reviewed for renewal. But instead of adapting their capabilities, Dad had doubled down on traditional manufacturing, convinced that the electric vehicle trend was overblown. That's when I struck. I formed an acquisition company called Industrial Solutions Group and made a formal offer to purchase Kane Industries for $15 million, exactly 60% of what Dad claimed the company was worth. The offer was contingent on Kane Industries losing their GM contract renewal, which my inside information suggested was almost certain. Dad rejected the offer immediately, calling it an insult from some nobody investment group. He had no idea that Industrial Solutions Group was backed by my portfolio of companies and that the nobody making the offer was his own son. 3 weeks later, GM announced that Kane Industries had not been selected for contract renewal. Their annual revenue dropped by 40% overnight. Suddenly, my $15 million offer looked a lot more reasonable. But I wasn't done. I used my consulting relationships to ensure that Ford and Chrysler also understood Kane Industries' limitations when their contract renewals came up 6 months later. By the end of the year, Kane Industries had lost all 3 of their major contracts and was facing bankruptcy. That's when Dad finally accepted my offer. He had no choice. The personal guarantees he'd signed meant that losing the company would bankrupt him personally. Selling to Industrial Solutions Group for $15 million would at least allow him to pay off the company's debts and retire with some dignity intact. The closing was scheduled for December 15th, exactly 1 week before our annual family Christmas dinner. Dad still had no idea who was buying his company. The legal documents listed Industrial Solutions Group as the purchaser, with Austin Reed as the primary contact. As far as Dad knew, he was selling to some faceless investment firm that would probably strip the company for parts and fire all the employees. I let him believe that right up until the moment I walked into the conference room for the closing. Dad was sitting at the far end of a mahogany table, flanked by his lawyer and accountant. He looked older than his 62 years, worn down by months of fighting to save his company. Austin Reed was seated across from him, along with 2 lawyers representing Industrial Solutions Group. When I walked in and took the seat at the head of the table, Dad's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then horror. "Hello, Dad," I said quietly. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." The room was dead silent. Dad's lawyer started to say something, but Dad held up a hand to stop him. His eyes were locked on mine, and I could see him trying to process what was happening. "Marcus," he said finally, "what are you doing here?" "I'm here to complete the acquisition of Kane Industries," I replied, opening the folder in front of me. "Industrial Solutions Group is my company. I'm the one who's been buying your business." Dad's face went white. "That's impossible. You don't have that kind of money. You work for some small consulting firm." "Actually, I own 7 companies with combined annual revenues of over $80 million. I've been building this portfolio for the past 5 years while you were busy telling everyone what a disappointment I was." I slid a document across the table to him. "This is a list of every company in my portfolio, along with their financial statements. You'll notice that 3 of them are manufacturing companies that compete directly with Kane Industries. We're the ones who've been underbidding you on contracts for the past 18 months. Dad picked up the document with shaking hands. As he read through the list, his expression changed from shock to something approaching terror. "The automotive consulting work I mentioned at family dinners? That was me advising GM, Ford, and Chrysler on supplier selection criteria for electric vehicle components. I'm the one who told them that Kane Industries wasn't capable of adapting to the industry transition." Austin Reed leaned forward. "Mr. Kane, your son has been planning this acquisition for over 2 years. Every contract you lost, every competitive disadvantage you faced, it was all orchestrated by the son you said would never amount to anything." Dad looked around the room as if searching for an escape route. "This isn't legal. It's some kind of conflict of interest. I can challenge this." I shook my head. "Everything we've done is completely legal. I've never used insider information from Kane Industries because I've never had access to any. I built my competitive advantage through superior operations, better technology, and more strategic thinking. The same qualities you told me I lacked." I opened another folder and pulled out a thick stack of contracts. "These are signed agreements with GM, Ford, and Chrysler to supply electric vehicle components starting next year. Combined, they're worth $45 million annually, 3 times what Kane Industries was generating before you lost your contracts." Dad stared at the contracts, and I could see the exact moment he realized the full scope of what I'd accomplished. His company was bankrupt. His life's work was being sold for a fraction of its former value. And the buyer was the son he'd dismissed as a failure for 32 years. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you do this to your own family?" I leaned back in my chair and studied his face. For the first time in my life, I was looking at William Kane not as my dismissive father, but as a business rival who had been outmaneuvered and defeated. "Because you taught me that success is the only thing that matters," I said quietly. "You spent my entire life telling me I wasn't good enough, smart enough, or driven enough to build something meaningful. You gave Derek $200,000 to start his business and used your connections to launch Sophia's career, but you wouldn't even take my phone calls when I was trying to get my consulting company off the ground." I gestured toward the contracts on the table. "So I built something bigger than Derek's real estate business. I created more value than Sophia's law career. And I did it without any help from you, using the skills you claimed I didn't have. Dad's lawyer cleared his throat. Mr. Kane, we can proceed with the closing as scheduled, or we can explore other options. But given the financial situation, I would recommend completing the sale. Dad looked at me one more time, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before: respect. Not love, not pride, but recognition that he had fundamentally misjudged me. Complete the sale, he said quietly. The paperwork took 2 hours to finalize. By the time we were done, I owned Kane Industries and everything that came with it: the equipment, the contracts, the intellectual property, and most importantly, the family legacy that Dad had spent 40 years building. As Dad gathered his documents to leave, I made him one final offer. The company needs someone to oversee the transition to electric vehicle manufacturing, I said. If you're interested, I could use a consultant with your industry experience. The pay would be $75,000 a year, about what I was making when you offered me that entry-level position. Dad stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. I think I'll retire. He walked out of the conference room without another word, leaving me alone with Austin Reed and the lawyers. How does it feel? Reed asked. I looked out the window at the parking lot where Dad was getting into his car. The same BMW he'd been driving for 8 years because Kane Industries' financial troubles had prevented him from upgrading. It feels like justice, I said. 3 days later, we held our annual family Christmas dinner. I arrived at Dad's house, which would soon be on the market, since he couldn't afford the mortgage payments without his salary from Kane Industries, with a small wrapped gift and a bottle of expensive wine. Derek and Sophia were already there, along with their respective partners. The atmosphere was tense. Word had gotten out that Kane Industries had been sold, and everyone knew Dad was struggling financially, but they didn't know the details. So, Marcus, Derek said after we'd sat down for dinner, Dad mentioned you work in business consulting. Maybe you could help him figure out what went wrong with the company. I looked across the table at Dad, who was pushing food around his plate without eating. He hadn't told them. Even after everything that had happened, he couldn't bring himself to admit that the son he'd dismissed as a failure had orchestrated the destruction of his empire. Actually, I said, I think your father's situation is more complicated than you realize. The automotive industry is changing rapidly, and companies that can't adapt get left behind. Sometimes the business decisions that seem smart in the short term turn out to be strategic mistakes. Sophia nodded sagely. That's the problem with small family businesses. They don't have the resources or expertise to compete with larger corporations. Exactly, I agreed. Although in this case, it wasn't a larger corporation that outcompete Kane Industries. It was a smaller, more efficient company that understood the market better. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the gift I'd brought for Dad. Speaking of which, I brought you something. Dad took the small wrapped box with trembling hands. Inside was a business card holder made from brushed steel, the same material Kane Industries had specialized in manufacturing. Engraved on the front were the words Marcus Kane, CO, Industrial Solutions Group. Dad stared at the business card holder for a long moment, then looked up at me with the expression of a man who had just realized he'd been playing chess against a grandmaster. You bought Kane Industries, he said quietly. The room went silent. Derek's fork clattered against his plate. Sophia's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. I didn't just buy it, I corrected. I systematically dismantled its competitive advantages, undermined its market position, and forced it into bankruptcy so I could acquire it at a fraction of its value. Then I used my superior operational capabilities and strategic planning to secure contracts worth 3 times what Kane Industries was generating at its peak. I pulled out my phone and showed them the announcement that had been published in the Industry Trade magazine that morning. Industrial Solutions Group announces major expansion in electric vehicle component manufacturing. The company Dad spent 40 years building is now a subsidiary of my portfolio. And next year, when the electric vehicle transition accelerates, it's going to be more profitable than it ever was under his management. Derek found his voice first. That's impossible. You're a consultant. You don't have that kind of money. I smiled and pulled out another document. This is my personal financial statement, audited by PricewaterhouseCoopers. My net worth is currently $23 million, and my companies generate over $80 million in annual revenue. I've been building this portfolio for 5 years while you thought I was struggling to pay my rent. Sophia leaned forward, her legal mind trying to process what she was hearing. How is that possible? We never saw any signs that you were successful. Because I didn't need your validation, I replied. I learned early that this family measures worth by external recognition rather than actual achievement. So I built my success quietly without fanfare or family announcements. While Derek was borrowing money from Dad to flip houses and Sophia was networking at law firm parties, I was acquiring companies and building real wealth. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where I'd grown up feeling invisible and worthless. The funny thing is, Dad could have been part of this. If he'd taken my consulting company seriously 5 years ago, if he'd treated me as an equal instead of a disappointment, I might have helped Kane Industries adapt to the industry changes instead of destroying it. But he was so convinced that I was a failure that he never bothered to find out what I was actually capable of. I turned back to face the table, where my family was staring at me like I was a stranger. So now Kane Industries is mine. The family legacy belongs to the son who was never good enough to inherit it. And the father who spent 32 years telling me I'd never amount to anything is going to spend his retirement explaining to his friends how he lost everything to the child he underestimated. Dad finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you going to do with the company?" "I'm going to make it successful," I said simply. "More successful than it ever was under your management. I'm going to prove that the son you dismissed as a loser is actually a better businessman than you ever were." I picked up my coat and headed toward the door. "Thank you for dinner. And Dad? That consulting position is still open if you change your mind. But the pay is non-negotiable." I left them sitting in stunned silence around the dinner table, in the house that would soon be sold to pay off debts, discussing the reality that everything they thought they knew about me had been wrong. 6 months later, Kane Industries, now operating as a division of Industrial Solutions Group, had completed its transition to electric vehicle component manufacturing. We were profitable, growing, and positioned to capitalize on the industry transformation that Dad had dismissed as a fad. Derek's real estate business was struggling because he'd overleveraged himself buying properties with Dad's help, and Dad could no longer provide financial backing. Sophia was still successful at her law firm, but her partnership track had slowed because she'd lost the family connections that had been accelerating her career. And me? I was building something bigger than any of them had imagined possible. I never did hear back from Dad about that consulting position. He retired quietly, sold the family home, and moved to a modest condo in Florida. We haven't spoken since that Christmas dinner, but I get updates through family friends who seem both impressed and terrified by what I accomplished. Derek reached out once, asking if I needed any real estate services for my business acquisitions. I politely declined and recommended a more experienced commercial real estate firm. Sophia sent a LinkedIn connection request which I ignored. Because here's what they still don't understand. I didn't destroy Dad's business for revenge. I did it to prove a point. Success isn't about being the loudest person in the room or the most charming networker. It's about understanding systems, identifying opportunities, and executing strategies that other people can't see. For 32 years, my family measured my worth by their standards and found me lacking. But their standards were wrong. Athletic ability doesn't predict business success. Social charisma doesn't guarantee long-term achievement. And the quiet kid who keeps his head down and works methodically might just be building something bigger than anyone imagined. I learned to be invisible in my own family, and that invisibility became my greatest strategic advantage. While they were watching each other compete for Dad's approval, I was watching the business world and learning how to win at a game they didn't even know they were playing. The boy who was never good enough became the man who was too good for them to understand. The son who couldn't earn his father's respect became the businessman who didn't need it. And Kane Industries, the legacy that Dad thought would never belong to me, is now the foundation of something much larger and more successful than he ever dreamed possible. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's proving that you were capable of greatness all along, and they were just too blind to see it. That's the real lesson here. Family favoritism doesn't just hurt the overlooked child, it blinds parents to potential they're too arrogant to recognize. My father spent so much time celebrating Derek's modest achievements and Sophia's conventional success that he missed the fact that his disappointing son was quietly building an empire. Now, when people ask me about my success, I tell them the truth. The greatest gift my father ever gave me was underestimating me. Because when no one expects anything from you, you're free to exceed every expectation. And when the people who dismissed you finally realize what you've accomplished, the look on their faces is worth more than any childhood approval you never received. My name is Marcus Kane, and I built my fortune on the foundation of my family's blindness. They taught me that worth has to be earned, and I earned mine by proving them wrong about everything they thought they knew about success. The quiet son became the powerful CEO. The family disappointment became the business genius. And the legacy they thought would never be mine is now just the beginning of something they could never have imagined. That's what happens when you underestimate the quiet ones. We're not just watching, we're planning. And when we're ready to move, the game is already over. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family? How far would you go to prove that their assumptions about your potential were completely wrong? What would you do if you had the power to show everyone who dismissed you exactly what you were capable of achieving? Let me know in the comments what you think about Marcus's journey from family disappointment to business empire builder. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Revenge Galore for more stories where justice hits hard and betrayal never goes unpunished.